I told you from the start that the murder case against Constable Zachary Rolfe stank. Stank to high heaven of politics, particularly of race politics of the left. And last Friday, after 2 gruelling years, Constable Rolfe was finally cleared by a jury unanimously of the murder of a violent Aboriginal offender who stabbed first him and then Rolfe's partner with scissors until Rolfe shot him 3 times in 3 seconds. Now, to me, there was never the shadow of a doubt that Rolfe acted in self-defence and the defence of his partner, and the body cam video only confirmed it. The question is, why on earth did police command still charge Rolfe with murder just 4 days afterwards, and charge him with murder against the recorded protests of detectives investigating the shooting? What led to this bizarre decision? Well, let's go through that before I talk to Constable Rolfe's father. Constable Rolfe himself was going to come on the show, but we'll explain that later too. This shooting occurred in the volatile Aboriginal town of Unanimously in the Northern Territory. Rolfe, who's a former soldier, decorated for heroism, had been called in from Alice Springs to arrest Walker for breaking bail conditions after he'd been jailed for violent crimes. In fact, just 3 days earlier, Walker had chased away local police with an axe when they tried to arrest him. But when Rolfe and his partner tried to arrest Walker, he stabbed them with scissors, blade open, until he was shot. Now, from that moment, Australia's race baiters took over, made this a story of, white racism, white police brutally killing another poor Aboriginal man. Here is SBS, for instance, interviewing one of the families at Unanimously, who for a while had looked after Walker as a child when his mother, who was ruined by drink and petrol sniffing, couldn't and wouldn't. They also are the grandparents of Walker's girlfriend.
We had one happy family in our house, sharing with my granddaughter. There was the laughter, then there was the joke with the other families in my house, and that's all gone, can't be replaced.
That image of a nice Aboriginal boy in a laughing, loving relationship is actually false. For years, in fact, Walker had bashed his girlfriend, leaving scars on her face, once breaking her hand with a piece of iron. Yes, I know, Walker did have a shocking childhood. If only he'd been rescued, or as too many activists today say, stolen as a child. But he never had a chance, and he grew into a violent and disturbed teenager. But to our race industry, details like that simply didn't matter. That Constable Rolfe was fighting for his life and his partner's life, that didn't matter. This had to be a story of white racism and Aboriginal innocence. So after the shooting, race protests were arranged around the country, from Unanimously and Alice Springs to our biggest cities. In the Northern Territory, Chief Minister Michael Gunner and his brand new hand-picked Chief Commissioner Jamie Chalker were clearly alarmed by the danger of protests. Documents suggest that it was in fact as early as the Monday after the shootings, just 2 days earlier, that Northern Territory Police Command decided Walker must be charged with murder. And the very next day, Gunner and his police chief flew to Unanimously. And Gunner, the chief of the Northern Territory's commissioner, chief boss, he made the crowd a very unusual promise that, to be suggested, he'd already made up his mind. He promised them that consequences would flow from the shooting. But which consequences? Against Rolfe? Is that what the Chief Minister meant? In fact, the very next day, Rolfe was charged with murder, to the outrage of the Northern Territory Police Association, to the outrage of detectives and many members. And that wasn't the end at all. The very next day, the Northern Territory's Anti-Corruption Commission, who'd been appointed to oversee an allegedly independent investigation into this shooting, met other Aboriginal protesters in Alice Springs and said this.
One of the most important messages here today is Black Lives Matter. Anybody who says contrary to that is guilty of corrupt behaviour.
Now, excuse me, if I felt by that point that this investigation was far more about pleasing race protesters than seeking true justice, not just for Kumanjayi Walker, but for Constable Rolfe. And even today, the protests and the race baiting, they continue. Inflammatory reports stressing that Rolfe was white and the dead man, just a teenager, was Aboriginal. Inflammatory and ignorant complaints by an activist lawyer in the Sydney Morning Herald that Rolfe wasn't found guilty of murder, falsely claiming that the law let us kill Aboriginal people, deceitfully claiming, for instance, that Walker was shot for merely threatening to have scissors, not in fact for using them on the police. And Get Up, the left-wing activist group, falsely claiming that justice was not done, that this was brutal and racist policing. I've only just skimmed the surface of this extraordinary case. But already you may gather my amazement. The Northern Territory's Chief Commissioner has not resigned in disgrace, not even apologised. The Northern Territory Chief Minister, he's not apologised either. And I ask every police officer in the Northern Territory, how can you now feel safe under this administration in defending yourself from a potentially murderous attack? Joining me now is the father of Zachary Rolfe, Richard Rolfe. Your son wanted to come on this show. What has forced him to pull out?
Well, Andrew, after the verdict, the unanimous verdict of not guilty on Friday, 2 hours after that, the Police Commissioner, Jamie Chalker, gave a rambling media conference where there were veiled threats made, which didn't make sense to us until we got a call from the Police Association explaining that Zach had been suspended again. So unfortunately, he's unable to tell his story at the moment until the next chapter is resolved.
So they charge him with murder. He gets off, as of course he should have, and now they suspended him anyway. It sounds to me a little vindictive, to be honest. Now, for the viewers' interest, this is the comment that Zachary Rolfe has publicly made since being proved innocent on the steps of the courthouse on the day. Have a listen.
Obviously, I think that was the right decision to make, but a lot of people are hurting today. Kumanjai's family and his community, and he didn't need to get to this point, so I'm going to leave this space for them.
Now, one of the reasons given for suspending him now is that he's been talking to the media. Is that correct, Richard?
It's been published in other media organisations that is the reason why he's been suspended, but we found out this afternoon that the police have decided to change the terminology and he is now on directed leave. Directed leave actually means he's suspended, but they're calling it by another name. There are some disciplinary matters that they want to discuss with him, which will take over a month before it gets to that. Whether it includes the commentary because of what he said on the steps of the Supreme Court, we'll find out in due course.
Now, Richard Rolfe, we can't go too far in guessing the motives of the Police Commissioner and the Chief Minister in the handling of this case against your son. But as Zach's father, what did you think of it all?
Honestly, I thought it was disgraceful. I thought in Australia we had a separation of powers. So to see them standing together in Unanimously 3 days after the shooting and only hours after my son's details had been deliberately leaked onto social media to start the death threats against him and my wife, myself, yes, I thought it was atrocious. For the Chief Minister to come out and say consequences will flow, and for the Police Commissioner to say exactly the same thing in a private meeting with the police that were stationed at Unanimously, instead of thanking them for their incredible work in the 3 days after the shooting, was disgraceful.
Now, your son's barrister has attacked the police investigation of this case. To me, there are just so many suspicious parts to that investigation. But can you tell the viewers about just one aspect that stunned me? We didn't hear about this until, so many months later. A draft police report for the coroner that concluded that Zachary Rolfe, your son, was actually innocent. Briefly, who did that report, and then what happened to it?
Well, Scott Pollock was an investigator, 35 years in the Northern Territory Police Force, the best they had. previously highly praised by the coroner for his work. And the evaluation that he made about the decision to charge Zach was that it was ill-conceived, misinformed and wrong. That report was hidden from the defence and from the court. It was hidden by both the Northern Territory Police Force and the DPP, and it took a subpoena from Zach's lawyers to actually get that report released to us, but we only got it in a redacted format. But it actually gets worse, Andrew, because the Police Commissioner had promised in an interview to The Australian back in February 2020 that the investigation would withstand all scrutiny, and yet somehow the Crown didn't present Scott Pollock or the Pollock report in the trial.
I still struggle to understand how that could possibly have happened. I thought, and like I say, that's just one aspect of, we could go on all night about
only one
really strange things that happened in this whole investigation. There are now journalists and activists, though, Richard Rolfe, saying, well, justice wasn't done in this case, except they don't mean justice as I understand the term. They say this is just one more example of white racism against Aborigines. What's your response to that?
It's incorrect. Justice was served on the Friday morning after the jury received the full transcript of the judge's directions. I assume that it would have taken them an hour to 2 hours to read the 2 3/4 hour directions that he gave the previous day, which meant that it really took 1 hour for the jury to unanimously decide that he was not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter, and not guilty of death by a violent act. But because of the enormous number of concerns about the investigation, I understand why so many people are concerned that there is a cover-up. I think we're going to have to wait for the coroner to unravel what has happened between the Police Commissioner and the Chief Minister.
I hope I can't understand how your family and Zachary, your son, has coped with all this over 2 years. How are you guys going?
Okay, we flew into Canberra last night. We're together as a family, and just looking forward to seeing what the next chapter brings. But Andrew, thank you so much for your interest in this story. I know within 1 week of Zach being charged, you wanted to make sure that the story was before the Australian public. You never said that Zach was innocent. You never said that Zach was guilty, but you recognised that the speed with which Zach was charged was ridiculous. So thank you so much for your interest in this story.
Richard, it was just plain as a pikestaff to me that due process was not being followed. And I'm so glad that justice was done, and shame on those that insist to this day that it wasn't. And I admire the strength of your family in the face of such vilification and misrepresentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.